They say that blood is thicker than water, a bond forged in the shared echoes of a family's heart. But they never tell you that sometimes the deepest cuts come not from a stranger's sword, but from the quiet betrayal of a knife you once thought was there to protect you. They don't mention that the silence before a storm is not a sign of peace, but the cold, hard calculation of thunder gathering its fury. On a rain-swept November night in Chicago, as the sky wept over the city's steel and glass, Ethan Vance learned this colder truth. He stood on the manicured lawn of the Vance family estate, a ghost haunting the edges of his own life, the manicured green turning to mud beneath his worn shoes. He was 25 years old, with the gentle eyes of an artist and a spirit that had always believed in the inherent goodness of his family. Now, those eyes were hollow, reflecting the storm both in the sky and within his soul. The great oak door of the mansion, a door he had walked through thousands of times, had just closed with a sound of finality, a sound like a tomb being sealed. Inside, bathed in the warm, golden light of chandeliers, were his brother and his mother. Mark, the golden son, the heir apparent, his handsome face a mask of feigned sorrow that barely concealed a chilling glint of victory. And Eleanor, his mother, the woman whose lullabies had been his sanctuary, her back turned to him. A portrait of maternal trust that had been shattered and expertly reshaped by a serpent's whisper. He clutched a small cardboard box in his hands, its contents meager, a framed photo of his late father, a few design journals, and the last remnants of the person he used to be. The biting wind did not chill him. The icy rain soaking through his thin jacket did not make him shiver. A different kind of cold had taken root deep within his soul, a frost of pure betrayal that numbed him to everything else. Framed for embezzlement, accused of betraying the very company his father had built on integrity, and disowned by the two people he loved most in the world. He had lost his name, his home, his past, and his future, all in the space of a single evening. He looked up at the warm windows of the mansion, each one a memory, now a monument to a life that was no longer his. And in that moment, standing on the precipice of ruin, something within him did not break. It hardened. A silent vow took shape in the crucible of his despair, a promise whispered not to the storm, but to himself. This was not an ending. It was a baptism. And he would be reborn from this water, not as the boy they had cast out, but as the man they would one day learn to fear. Before the fall, there was the kingdom. And in the heart of Chicago, the Vance construction empire was a kingdom built on a foundation more solid than reinforced concrete. It was built on the word of one man, Richard Vance. He was a titan of the old school, a man who saw skylines in his dreams and drew them onto napkins, a man whose handshake was a contract and whose integrity was the bedrock of every skyscraper that bore his family's name. When he passed, he left behind more than just a portfolio of iconic buildings that pierced the clouds. He left a legacy, a code of honor that was whispered in boardrooms and on construction sites alike. The Vance way was about building things to last, about quality over speed, about character over profit. And he left two sons to carry this legacy forward. The world saw only one heir. Mark Vance, the firstborn, was the sun around which the Vance solar system seemed to revolve. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with a smile that could disarm hostile investors, and a voice that resonated with the easy confidence of a man born to lead. He inherited his father's charisma, but not his patience, his ambition, but not his soul. In the years after Richard's death, Mark stepped into the role of CEO so seamlessly it felt like a destiny fulfilled. He was a master of the grand gesture, the public performance of leadership. He would stand at charity galas, a glass of champagne in hand, and speak eloquently of continuing his father's vision, of building a better Chicago. He knew every city council member's name, every major client's favorite golf course. He was the perfect corporate king, the golden son who made his mother, Eleanor, swell with pride. But those who worked closely with him saw the subtle shifts. They saw the way his eyes would glaze over during technical presentations, his impatience with budgets that prioritized structural integrity over aesthetic flair that could be sold at a higher margin. He was a brilliant salesman of a product he didn't fully understand, and the product was his own family's legacy. The true architect of that legacy, the silent keeper of Richard Vance's flame, worked in a sprawling, sunlit studio on the top floor of the Vance Tower. Ethan Vance was the quiet architect. Where Mark commanded rooms full of people, Ethan commanded light and space. He was 2 years younger than his brother, and in many ways, his opposite. He found his voice not in speeches, but in the clean, precise lines of a blueprint. He was the one who had truly inherited their father's gift, the almost mystical ability to understand the soul of a structure. His designs were innovative yet timeless, bold yet functional. It was Ethan's vision that had won the company the prestigious National Award for the Lakefront Library, a building that seemed to float on water. It was Ethan's genius that solved the impossible engineering puzzle for the St. Regis Tower. And it was Mark who stood on the podium to accept the awards. Mark, whose face was on the cover of Architectural Digest. Mark, who would clap Ethan on the back in private and say, "We did it, little brother. We did it." And Ethan, who loathed the spotlight and loved his brother, would simply nod, believing in the we, never realizing that in Mark's mind, the we was merely a royal pronoun. Their family dynamic was a carefully constructed, fragile ecosystem presided over by their mother, Eleanor Vance. A woman of formidable grace, she had been devastated by her husband's death. And in her grief, she clung to the son who most resembled the powerful public figure Richard had been. She saw Mark's ambition as a continuation of his father's strength, while she saw Ethan's quiet, introspective nature as a delicate sensitivity that needed protection. At their Sunday dinners in the grand family home, the conversation was always led by Mark. He would recount his week of negotiations, of power lunches, of strategic victories. Eleanor would listen, her eyes shining with admiration. When she turned to Ethan, her tone would soften, becoming more maternal, more concerned. "Are you getting enough sleep, dear? You look thin. That studio has no air." She never asked about his design philosophy or his vision for the company's future. She couldn't see that the engine of the entire Vance empire wasn't in the CEO's office, but in the quiet studio she worried so much about. Her love was a powerful, blinding force, and it created a hierarchy that Ethan accepted and Mark exploited. Ethan lived in the long, comforting shadow of his father. He often found himself standing before a large framed photograph in his studio. It was of him as a boy, no older than 10, wearing a hard hat that was far too big for him, standing beside his father on the steel skeleton of a rising skyscraper. He could still hear his father's voice, a low rumble against the city wind. "Look, Ethan," Richard had said, pointing to the grid of beams. "Anyone can pile steel on top of steel, but to make it sing, to make it strong enough to withstand any storm, that takes honesty. A building knows when you're lying to it. It knows when you cut corners. A building without integrity is just a pile of materials waiting to fall. A man is the same." This was the gospel Ethan lived by. It was why he would argue with contractors over the grade of concrete, why he would work through the night to perfect a load-bearing joint. He was building for permanence, for honesty. Mark, however, was building for the next quarter. The pressure to grow, to eclipse his father's already legendary success, was a constant fire in his gut. He began to see Ethan's meticulous, principled approach not as the company's greatest asset, but as a frustrating bottleneck. A delay of a week for a better material was, in Mark's eyes, a week of lost profit. A design that was safe and beautiful but expensive was a failure in his spreadsheet. The jealousy that had simmered beneath the surface for years, a quiet resentment of the one gift he could never possess, his brother's effortless genius, began to curdle into something more sinister. He would look at Ethan, hunched over a drafting table, lost in a world of angles and stress points, and the old, familiar affection would be replaced by a cold calculation. The quiet architect was a pillar holding up the family name. But Mark was beginning to realize that if a pillar stood in the way of his ambition, it had to be removed. The golden son looked at his brother, the keeper of their father's soul, and for the first time, he saw not a partner, but a problem that needed a final, decisive solution. The seed of the betrayal was not planted in a single moment of rage, but cultivated over years in the arid soil of Mark Vance's insecurity. To the outside world, He was the Sun King, but in the quiet, reflective hours of the night, he knew he was merely a planet orbiting the true, incandescent talent of his younger brother. He saw the way seasoned engineers and architects would look at Ethan, a reverence they never showed him. He heard the whispers that he was the suit, while Ethan was the soul of Vance Construction. The legacy of their father felt less like a throne he had inherited and more like a heavy crown that didn't quite fit, a constant reminder of his own perceived inadequacy. He didn't just want to run the company, he wanted to own its very spirit. And to do that, the spirit of his father, which lived on so purely in Ethan, had to be exercised. The decision, when it finally solidified in his mind, felt less like a betrayal and more like a grim necessity, a strategic move on a chessboard where only one king could remain. The plan was a masterpiece of corporate deceit, elegant in its cruelty. Mark called it the Riverbend Development. On paper, it was a ghost, a phantom project he created in the company's speculative accounts. He approached Arthur Finch, the company's timid, perpetually nervous chief financial officer, a man whose personal finances were a ruin of bad investments and gambling debts, a fact Mark had discovered and filed away for future use. In the sanctity of his office, Mark laid out the scheme, framing it not as theft, but as an aggressive, off-the-books acquisition strategy to secure a prime parcel of land before their rivals could react. He made it sound daring, visionary. Finch, caught between his own financial desperation and the overwhelming force of his CEO's charisma, agreed. He became the first cog in a machine designed to grind Ethan to dust. Together, they began weaving the web. Mark directed Finch to create a series of shell corporations with innocuous names like Midwest Logistical Solutions and Superior Holdings. Over 3 months, large sums of money were moved from Vance Construction's capital expenditure accounts into these entities, disguised as payments for surveyors, environmental assessments, and zoning consultations that never happened. The digital paper trail was a labyrinth designed to confuse any cursory audit. The final piece, the masterstroke of the entire conspiracy, was the destination. Using a scanned copy of Ethan's passport from his employee file and other personal details only a brother would know, Mark opened an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He named it Vance Designs International, a name so plausible, so perfectly aligned with what they might assume Ethan's secret ambitions to be, that it was diabolical. The final wire transfers, totaling nearly $15 million, were sent to this account. The trap was set. All that remained was to spring it. While the financial gears were turning, Mark began a subtle, insidious campaign to poison the mind of their mother. He would call her after long workdays, his voice heavy with manufactured weariness. "Mom, I'm worried about Ethan," he'd sigh. "He's brilliant, you know that, but he just doesn't see the big picture. He fought me for 3 weeks on the Tribune Tower renovation, insisting on a custom-milled Italian marble that would have pushed us 20% over budget. It's like he thinks money grows on trees." A week later, it would be, "He seems so distant lately, locked in his studio. I try to talk to him about our profit and loss statements, and his eyes just glaze over. It's like he feels he's above the business side of things." He was painting a picture, brushstroke by careful brushstroke, of an artist too self-absorbed and irresponsible to be trusted, a genius who had become a liability. Eleanor, already predisposed to see Mark as the pragmatist and Ethan as the dreamer, absorbed it all. The discovery was a piece of theater. Mark called an emergency meeting with the board's finance committee, his face a mask of grave concern. He explained that Finch, during a routine internal review, had found alarming irregularities. The investigation that followed was a farce, led by a team loyal to Mark, who followed the trail of breadcrumbs he had so carefully laid. Within a week, they had their culprit. The report was bound in dark leather, thick and damning, and it landed on Mark's desk with a soft, final thud. The confrontation did not happen in a sterile boardroom. Mark chose their father's office, a room that had been preserved as a shrine since his death. The air was thick with the scent of old leather, wood polish, and the faint, lingering aroma of Richard Vance's pipe tobacco. It was a sacred space, and what Mark was about to do was sacrilege. Ethan was summoned under the pretense of discussing a new project. He walked in, smiling, a roll of blueprints under his arm, and found his brother standing behind the great mahogany desk and his mother sitting stiffly in one of the leather armchairs, her face pale and drawn. The smile on Ethan's face died. "Ethan," Mark began, his voice a low, sorrowful murmur. "Sit down." He pushed the leather-bound report across the polished surface of the desk. "We have a problem." Ethan opened it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He saw pages of financial jargon, routing numbers, names of companies he had never heard of. Then he saw a scanned copy of a signature authorization for a wire transfer of $2 million. It was his signature, or a perfect, undeniable forgery of it. "Mark, what is this?" "I don't understand." "I think you do," Mark said, his voice hardening slightly. He launched into the narrative he had rehearsed 100 times. He spoke of a $15 million hole in their finances. He spoke of a secret offshore account. He spoke of ambition curdling into greed, of a brother who, resentful of living in his shadow, decided to steal from his own family to fund a secret, competing firm. Each word was a carefully aimed blow. "Mark, no, this is insane." Ethan looked from his brother's cold, accusatory eyes to his mother. "Mom, you can't believe this. This is a mistake. It has to be." But Eleanor was looking at the forged signature, at the name on the account, E. Vance Designs International. She was remembering Mark's weeks of concerns, his complaints about Ethan's financial recklessness. The seeds of doubt had taken root, and now they blossomed into a grotesque certainty. All she saw was her dreamer son confirming her worst fears, his denial sounding flimsy and desperate against the weight of the evidence in front of her. "How could you, Ethan?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "After everything your father built, his name, our name, you would drag it through the mud for this?" "I didn't. I would never." Ethan was on his feet now, his mind reeling, unable to process the sheer scale of the lie. He was an architect. He thought in terms of logic, of structure, of truth in materials. He couldn't build a defense because he couldn't comprehend the foundation of the accusation. It was built on nothing. It was built on air. Mark delivered the final, venomous strike. "Dad always said you were the talented one, the real artist," he said, his voice dripping with a lifetime of resentment disguised as sorrow. "But he also worried. He worried that you didn't have the character to handle it. I guess he was right." That was the blow that shattered him. The invocation of their father, the twisting of his love into a weapon, broke something deep inside Ethan. He looked at his mother's face, now a mask of cold, profound disappointment, and he knew he was lost. He had been tried, convicted, and sentenced by a jury of 2. The serpent's whisper had done its work. It had roared into a hurricane, tearing his world from its foundations and leaving him standing alone in the ruins. The sound of the office door clicking shut behind him was quiet, almost gentle, but it echoed in Ethan's ears like a cannon blast. He stood in the hallway of the 50th floor, a small cardboard box of his personal effects in his trembling hands, feeling the eyes of the entire company on him. He saw pity in the faces of some, a cold curiosity in others. Maria, his father's secretary who had been with the company for 30 years and used to give him candy as a child, turned away, pretending to be busy with a filing cabinet, her shoulders slumped. He was no longer Ethan Vance, the brilliant young architect. He was a contamination, a disease being purged from the body of the firm. The final humiliation was the silent walk to the elevator with Frank, the head of security, a man who had taught him how to throw a baseball. Frank didn't speak. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, as if the silence was a painful duty. As the elevator doors slid closed, separating him from Frank's averted gaze, Ethan felt the first true wave of vertigo. He wasn't just leaving his office, he was being ejected from his own life. The world outside the Vance Tower was a blur of noise and motion. He walked for hours, with no destination, the cardboard box growing heavier with each step. His feet, on autopilot, eventually led him to the familiar, tree-lined streets of the Lincoln Park neighborhood and then to the stone gates of the family home. It was here that the heavens opened, the cold November rain beginning to fall, mingling with the hot, silent tears he hadn't realized he was crying. The confrontation, the slamming door, the sight of his brother and mother turning their backs on him, it all solidified into the scene that would become the cornerstone of his nightmares. That first night, he was a ghost adrift in a city that had once been his playground. The cash in his wallet, a few $100s, suddenly felt like the only real thing he owned. He found a modest motel near the expressway, the kind with flickering neon signs and the faint smell of bleach. At the front desk, the clerk ran his corporate credit card. "It's been declined, sir." Ethan offered his personal debit card, the one linked to his own savings. "This one too. Account is frozen." The clerk's friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by a flat, suspicious stare. It was the first time Ethan was looked at, not as a Vance, but as a potential problem, a vagrant. He paid with cash, the transaction feeling shameful and illicit, and spent the night in a threadbare room, staring at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the roar of trucks on the highway, each sound a confirmation of his utter solitude. The days that followed were a systematic dismantling of his world. His first call was to David Chen, his closest friend at the firm, a man with whom he had pulled countless all-nighters, their bond forged over coffee and shared creative breakthroughs. The phone rang 5 times before David picked up. "Ethan?" His voice was strained, cautious. "Hey, Dave. Look, I need to talk to you. You have to know none of what they're saying is true." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled with a static that sounded like pity. "Look, man," David finally said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Mark held an all-hands meeting. He showed us documents. I can't get involved, Ethan. I have a mortgage, a kid on the way." The click of the phone ending the call was louder than any slammed door. He tried others. A former professor who had called him his most promising student. The professor's wife answered, politely explaining he was traveling indefinitely. He called a cousin who rushed off the phone, claiming a forgotten appointment. The story had been ruthlessly efficient in its spread. Mark hadn't just fired him, he had excommunicated him. He was a leper, and the bell warning others of his approach was the Vance name itself. His financial freefall accelerated. He quickly burned through his cash. Desperate, he found a pawn shop in a gritty, forgotten corner of the city. The air inside smelled of dust and desperation. He removed the gold watch from his wrist, the one his father had given him for his college graduation, its back engraved with the words, "Build with integrity." The pawnbroker, a man with weary eyes, barely glanced at the inscription before offering him a fraction of its worth. Handing it over felt like a physical amputation, a severing of his last tangible connection to the man he'd idolized. The watch was followed by his high-end laptop, his drafting tools, his expensive leather jacket. He was selling off pieces of his old identity to pay for a new, wretched one. He moved from the motel to a hostel, sharing a room with 6 strangers, the nights filled with the sounds of coughing and troubled sleep. He learned to keep his possessions in a locker, to eat cheap food from street vendors, to become invisible. He spent his days in the warmth of the public library, not reading, but simply existing, watching the clock. Sometimes, he would search for news about his family online. He found a press release from Vance Construction announcing a strategic restructuring of the design department to enhance fiscal accountability. It never mentioned his name, but it didn't have to. The business journals wrote articles praising Mark Vance's decisive leadership in navigating a difficult internal matter. They were erasing him from his own story, painting his absence as a net positive, a necessary correction. He was a ghost, haunting the periphery of a life he was no longer allowed to live. The breaking point came in December. A brutal cold spell had gripped Chicago, and Ethan was ill-equipped for it, his coat thin, his shoes worn. He found himself by the frozen edge of Lake Michigan, the wind a physical force that threatened to push him over. Across the icy expanse, the city skyline rose like a row of jagged teeth. He could pick out the buildings he had helped create, the street, Regis Tower, whose innovative truss system he had designed, the shimmering glass of the lakefront library. They were monuments to his talent, and now they mocked him, symbols of a kingdom from which he was eternally banished. The full weight of his loss crashed down upon him. It wasn't just the money or the career. It was the love of his mother, the bond with his brother, the very foundation of his identity. He felt a profound, aching emptiness that the wind and the cold could not touch. For a terrifying moment, he thought about walking toward the gray, frozen water to let the cold finally numb the pain for good. But as he sat there on a frosted park bench, on the absolute precipice of surrender, something else stirred within him. The pain, so immense and all-consuming, began to perform a strange alchemy. It burned away the grief, the shock, the sorrow. It cauterized the wounds, leaving not scar tissue but something harder, steel. He thought of his father's watch, of the words, "Build with integrity." He thought of Mark's smug, triumphant face. He thought of his mother's cold disappointment, and the disparate feelings of sadness and loss began to fuse together, solidifying into a single, pure, crystalline emotion: rage. A cold, quiet, patient rage. The naive young man who believed in the inherent goodness of his family died on that bench. The tears on his face froze. He realized, with chilling clarity, that the world his father had believed in, a world where integrity was rewarded and truth prevailed, was a lie. Justice wasn't a right. It was a weapon to be forged. It was a kingdom to be conquered. He stood up, the wind no longer feeling like an enemy, but a reminder of the coldness now inside him. He walked away from the lake, sold the last vestige of his old life, a pair of silver cufflinks, and bought a one-way bus ticket to New York City. He was done being the victim. He was done being erased. He was going to disappear, yes, but only so he could learn how to rebuild himself into the storm that would one day return and tear their whole rotten kingdom down. The bus ride to New York was a long, gray smear of highways and forgotten towns, a fitting purgatory between the life that was stolen from him and a future that was a terrifying, formless void. Ethan arrived at the Port Authority bus terminal with less than $50 in his pocket, a threadbare coat, and a name he was beginning to hate. New York City in the dead of winter was not a welcoming place. It was a monolith of indifference, a vast, roaring ocean of 8 million souls, and he was just a single, insignificant drop. The city that never sleeps had no interest in his broken dreams. For weeks, he survived in the city's anonymous underbelly, moving between homeless shelters and the all-night warmth of subway cars. The shame was a constant companion, a cold weight in his stomach. The man who once commanded budgets of hundreds of millions of dollars now counted his pennies for a cup of coffee. His first stroke of what felt like luck was actually a descent into deeper irony. He landed a job as a night cleaner for a third-party custodial service. His assigned building was the obsidian shard of the Sterling Coal Tower in Midtown Manhattan, the headquarters of one of the most prestigious architectural firms in the world. And so, his new life began. Every night at 11, Ethan Vance, the prodigy, the visionary, would put on a gray janitor's uniform and begin his shift. He would push his cart of cleaning supplies through the silent, majestic halls, the only sound, the soft squeak of his rubber-soled shoes on polished marble. He would empty the trash cans of men and women living the life he had lost, cleaning the smudges from the glass walls of conference rooms where they debated the very principles of design he held so sacred. He was a ghost haunting a temple built for his religion, invisible to the gods who inhabited it during the day. The proximity to his old world was a unique form of torture, a nightly reminder of everything that had been taken from him. His final task each night was to clean the main executive boardroom on the 60th floor. For weeks, the room had been in a state of controlled chaos. The enormous central table was perpetually covered with the bones of a single, struggling project, the Odyssey Tower. It was to be the firm's crowning achievement, a slender, twisting residential super skyscraper that was the talk of the industry. But Ethan, with his trained eye, could see it was a nightmare. The models showed signs of repeated modification. The blueprints were layered with rejected revisions, and the discarded papers in the trash were filled with frantic, frustrated calculations. He didn't need to hear the gossip to know the truth. The design was flawed. Its beautiful, unconventional shape was an engineering catastrophe, dangerously susceptible to the high-altitude winds that swept across Manhattan. The architects at Sterling Coal were stuck in a loop of failure, and the project was bleeding money and credibility. One night, exhausted and numb, Ethan lingered longer than usual in the boardroom. The city lights twinkled below like a fallen constellation. On the table, beneath the harsh glare of an overhead lamp, lay a new set of stress analysis reports. The data was stark, a series of red warnings that predicted catastrophic torsional buckling in anything over a 50-mile-per-hour wind. He saw their proposed solutions: bulky internal counterweights, ugly reinforcement collars that destroyed the building's elegant lines. They were trying to solve the problem with brute force by adding mass and rigidity. They were trying to fight the wind. And Ethan remembered a lesson his father had taught him years ago on a stormy day, watching a mighty oak tree stand rigid against a gale while a slender willow bent and swayed, untouched. "Don't fight the force," his father had said. "Redirect it. Make its strength your own." The idea struck him not like a lightning bolt, but like a rising tide, a solution that felt as if it had been waiting within him all along. He saw it with perfect clarity, not an internal fix, but an external one. A delicate, powerful exoskeleton, a web of hypertensile steel alloy that would wrap around the building's curves. It wouldn't be a cage, but a second skin, a diagrid inspired by the intricate, overlapping fibers of a dragonfly's wing. It would catch the wind's energy, not absorbing it, but distributing it throughout the entire structure, turning a destructive force into a stabilizing one. The janitor, the ghost, was gone. The architect was alive. His hand, shaking slightly, found a discarded piece of vellum and a charcoal pencil. He began to draw. The lines flowed from him with a desperate, forgotten urgency. It was more than a technical drawing. It was a resurrection. In 10 minutes, he had sketched a vision that was not only the engineering solution, but was also breathtakingly beautiful, an enhancement to the original design. He was so lost in the act of creation that he didn't hear the distant ding of an elevator. A sudden noise from down the hall startled him, and in his haste to resume his duties and remain invisible, he left the sketch lying on the table, a single piece of unsigned genius amidst a sea of expensive failure. Alistair Blackwood did not move through the world so much as the world rearranged itself around him. At 75, he was a legend, a reclusive billionaire who had built his empire on an almost supernatural instinct for value and a ruthless intolerance for incompetence. He was the secret client behind the Odyssey Tower, his money funding the entire project, and his patience had run out. He swept into the Sterling Coal offices just before midnight, his presence a blast of Arctic air in the heated building. He found the firm's 2 senior partners waiting for him, their faces pale with dread. He ignored them, stalking into the boardroom. His hawk-like eyes scanned the table, his expression hardening with contempt at the clumsy, brutish solutions they had proposed. He was about to unleash a tirade that would have ended their careers when his eyes stopped. Lying partially obscured by a thick binder was a single, simple sketch. He picked it up. The anger on his face slowly dissolved, replaced by a profound stillness, a look of intense, almost reverent concentration. The partners stared, confused. Alistair saw it instantly. The audacity, the elegance, the impossible simplicity of true genius. This wasn't just a fix, it was a transformation. "Who drew this?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The partners looked at the sketch, then at each other, baffled. Neither of them had ever seen it before. "I am paying your firm 7 figures a month," Alistair hissed, his voice like cracking ice. "And the only piece of intelligent work in this entire room is anonymous. Find out who drew this. Now." A frantic search began. No one recognized the style. No one would claim it. Finally, on Alistair's command, they pulled the security footage. And they watched in stunned silence as the grainy image of their night janitor paused his work, picked up a pencil, and in a few brief, inspired minutes, solved a problem that had stumped their entire team of world-class architects for 6 months. The next night, Ethan was wiping down the reception desk when 2 security guards and a terrified-looking office manager intercepted him. He assumed he was being fired for taking too long on his rounds. Instead, he was escorted back to the 60th floor, to the boardroom, where Alistair Blackwood sat alone at the head of the great table, the sketch placed neatly in front of him. "Is this yours?" Alistair asked, his voice calm, his eyes boring into Ethan. Ethan's mind raced. This was a trap. They thought he'd stolen intellectual property. He gave a single, wary nod. Alistair didn't smile. He began to question him, his queries sharp, precise, and deeply technical. The geometry of this diagrid is unconventional. Explain how it counters harmonic resonance without adding significant mass. What specific alloy composition did you envision to handle the tensile load at the upper vertices? Ethan, expecting accusations, was caught off guard by the legitimacy of the questions. The fear in him began to recede, replaced by the familiar spark of intellectual passion. The janitor's stoop fell away from his shoulders. He stood up straighter. He met Alistair's gaze and began to speak. He talked about biomimicry, about tensegrity structures, about how the solution wasn't about rigidity, but about managed flexibility. He didn't just answer. He elaborated, he taught, he revealed the deep, intricate well of knowledge he possessed. When he finished, the room was silent. Alistair Blackwood stared at the young, gaunt man in the ill-fitting janitor's uniform, but he no longer saw a cleaner. He saw a weapon, a brilliant, discarded, and profoundly undervalued weapon. After a long moment, the old man leaned forward. He did not offer praise. He offered something far more potent. "You're wasted emptying my trash cans," he said, his voice a low growl. "I want to know your story. I want you to tell me exactly who was stupid enough to throw you away." It wasn't a question. It was a demand. It was the sound of a key turning in the lock of a dungeon. It was the first, blinding glimmer of light in an endless, suffocating abyss. That night, in Alistair Blackwood's penthouse apartment high above Central Park, the city lights spread out below them like a carpet of scattered diamonds. Ethan, smelling of industrial-grade cleaner and stale coffee, recounted his story. He spoke in a flat, monotone voice, detailing the betrayal with the dispassionate air of a man describing a building's collapse. He expected pity, perhaps a measure of sympathy. He received none. Alistair listened without interruption, his steepled fingers pressed against his lips, his old eyes glinting with an emotion Ethan couldn't place. When Ethan finished, the old man was silent for a full minute before speaking, his voice a low growl. "Pathetic," he said, not cruelly, but as a simple statement of fact. "They didn't just steal your money and your name. They stole your fire and left a timid, whimpering animal in its place. Your brother isn't a genius. He's a common brute who used a complex weapon. The problem isn't that he stabbed you in the back. The problem is you never learned how to see the knife coming." Alistair stood and walked to the vast window. "I will not give you charity," he continued, his back to Ethan. "Charity creates beggars. I will make you an investment. I will give you the knowledge, the resources, and the capital to become a weapon more formidable than you can possibly imagine. In return, you will shed every last scrap of the sentimental boy who was cast out into the rain. You will kill Ethan Vance. You will forget he ever existed. You will become a creature of logic, of leverage, and of absolute, unwavering will. I'm going to teach you how to hunt lions, but first, you must stop thinking like a lamb." And so the deconstruction began. The first year was a relentless, brutal education in the very mechanics of his own ruin. Alistair didn't shelter him from the painful details. He immersed him in them. He made Ethan study the fraudulent documents Mark had created, not as a victim, but as a student of corporate warfare. He was forced to read textbooks on forensic accounting, contract law, and market manipulation, with his own betrayal as the primary case study. Nights were spent in Alistair's library, a vast, two-story room filled with the wisdom of predators. Days were spent in silence, observing Alistair in meetings, watching him dismantle arrogant CEOs with a few quiet, surgical questions. "You must understand the architecture of your enemy's power," Alistair would lecture, pacing the room. "A company, like a skyscraper, has load-bearing walls, vulnerabilities, and stress points. Your brother thinks he built an empire. I will teach you to see it for what it is, a poorly designed structure waiting for a controlled demolition." This education reshaped Ethan's mind. The artist who once found beauty in the graceful curve of a steel arch now found it in the elegant lethality of a poison pill defense. The architect who meticulously designed foundations learned how to scrutinize a company's balance sheet, identifying the hidden debts and inflated assets that formed its structural weaknesses. He discovered, to his own surprise, that he had a terrifying innate genius for it. The same part of his brain that could visualize a three-dimensional structure from a two-dimensional blueprint could now visualize the intricate flow of capital, power, and influence within a corporate ecosystem. He was learning to see the world not as a place of creation, but as a system of interlocking levers, all waiting for the right hand to pull them. As his mind was being reforged, his body and persona were being rebuilt from the ground up. Alistair was a demanding creator. A nutritionist and personal trainer were hired to erase the gaunt, starved look of the streets, replacing it with the lean, disciplined physique of a predator. A tailor was summoned, and Ethan's worn-out clothes were replaced by a wardrobe of bespoke suits in shades of charcoal and midnight blue, fabrics that were both armor and a statement of intent. A speech coach worked with him for hours, eliminating the last vestiges of hesitancy from his voice, teaching him the power of the pause, how to command a room with quiet, unshakable confidence. The final piece of the transformation was the death of his name. Ethan Vance is a ghost, Alistair announced one evening, 6 months into the process. A victim. His name is a liability, weighted down with shame and failure. That person is dead. Tell me who you are now. Ethan looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the window. The face looking back was his, but the eyes were different. Colder, sharper. The name came to him instinctively. Elias, he said, the word feeling strange and powerful on his tongue. Elias Vance. It was a subtle alteration, a private irony, a nod to the man he had been, and a declaration of the man he was becoming. For the next 4 years, Elias Vance was forged in the crucible of real-world combat. Alistair provided the initial capital for him to found his own private equity firm. Elias named it Phoenix Holdings. Its mission was simple and brutal. He targeted mid-sized, poorly managed companies, very often family-run businesses led by arrogant, complacent heirs, men exactly like his brother Mark. He would study his targets for months, learning every weakness, every secret. Then he would strike, using a combination of hostile takeovers, proxy battles, and psychological warfare. He became a whisper in the financial world, a myth. No one knew where Elias Vance came from. He had no social media presence, gave no interviews. All they knew was that his arrival was the prelude to a swift and bloodless coup. He never destroyed the companies he acquired. That would have been crude. Instead, he rebuilt them with architectural precision, purging the incompetent leadership, promoting hidden talent from within, and streamlining operations until they were lean, profitable, and ruthlessly efficient. He was building an army, an empire, and a fortune that would soon rival, and then eclipse, his own family's. By the end of the 5th year, the transformation was absolute. The boy who had wept in the Chicago rain was a distant memory, a character in a story that had happened to someone else. Elias Vance, at 30 years old, was a self-made billionaire, a creature of immense power and monastic self-discipline. He lived in a minimalist penthouse that resembled a modern art gallery more than a home. He moved with a quiet grace that was unnervingly still. The hot, chaotic rage that had once consumed him had been cooled and compressed over 5 years into a diamond-hard core of purpose. The signal to return came on a Tuesday morning. Elias was reviewing a quarterly report when his assistant placed a financial newspaper on his desk. On the cover was an article celebrating the groundbreaking of a new civic center in Chicago, the largest project in the city's history. And there, in the center of the photograph, was his brother Mark, shaking hands with the mayor, his smile as wide and brilliant as ever. The headline read, "Vance Construction Reaches New Heights." Elias stared at the photograph for a long time, his face a perfect, unreadable mask. There was no flicker of anger, no hint of pain. The image was simply data to be processed. He closed the newspaper, placed it neatly to one side, and pressed the intercom on his desk. "Catherine," he said, his voice calm and even, "clear my schedule for the next month and book me a flight to Chicago." The weapon had been forged, honed, and polished. It was finally time to go home. Elias Vance did not return to Chicago with the fanfare of a prodigal son, but with the stealth of an assassin. There was no emotional pilgrimage to old haunts, no wistful gaze at the skyline he had helped shape. He arrived on a private jet that landed at a small, executive airport, was met by a discreet car, and was taken to a sprawling, minimalist residence on the top floor of a new, anonymous glass tower, a building he had purchased entirely through a shell corporation. His command center was not in the heart of the financial district, but in a converted warehouse in the West Loop, a space of polished concrete floors, exposed brick, and stark black furniture. The only warmth came from the glow of a dozen monitors, displaying a silent, relentless stream of data, the vital signs of the Vance construction empire. For 5 years, he had been a ghost in the financial world. Now, he had come home to haunt his own family. His strategy was one of absolute invisibility, a war waged by 1,000 subtle cuts. He was a phantom pulling strings from miles away, his actions felt but his presence unseen. Mark had to feel like he was being crushed, not by an enemy, but by the sheer, unforgiving weight of the world itself. The first phase of the attack was aimed at the very foundation of Mark's business, his supply chain. Vance Construction, like all great builders, ran on relationships, on decades of trust with suppliers who provided the steel, concrete, and glass that formed the city's bones. Elias saw these relationships not as a strength, but as a centralized, critical vulnerability. His first target was Bedrock Concrete, a family-owned company that had been pouring foundations for the Vances since his grandfather's time. Elias's research team at Phoenix Holdings had identified a key weakness. The founder's grandson, who now ran the company, had more passion for sailing than for cement. Phoenix Holdings constructed an offer that was not merely generous, it was life-altering. It was swift, clean, and all cash, bypassing the need for industry-wide announcements. The deal was signed and sealed before the ink was dry on the press release. 2 weeks later, one of Mark's project managers for the massive Civic Center project made a frantic call to his office. A critical shipment of reinforced concrete was 4 days late, holding up the entire construction schedule. Mark, furious, got on the phone himself. The familiar, friendly voice of the old owner was gone, replaced by a cool, polite executive from the new management team. The executive was deeply apologetic, citing unforeseen logistical hurdles and system-wide protocol upgrades. The concrete arrived 2 days later, just barely meeting the required specifications, and accompanied by a new, significantly higher invoice, citing expedited service charges. It was the first cut, small enough to be dismissed as an annoyance, but deep enough to draw blood and disrupt the rhythm of Mark's well-oiled machine. The cuts kept coming. A month later, the primary supplier of high-tensile structural steel that Vance relied on for their skyscraper projects was acquired in a surprise hostile takeover by a mysterious East Coast investment firm. Suddenly, their long-standing price agreements were declared void. New contracts had to be negotiated, delaying projects by weeks. Next, the artisanal glass fabricator, responsible for the custom facades on Vance's luxury condominiums, announced they were at full capacity, having just signed an exclusive, multi-year contract with a new, unnamed developer. Mark was forced to scramble, finding alternative suppliers whose quality was inferior and whose prices were exorbitant. Each problem, viewed in isolation, seemed like bad luck. A supplier gets bought out, a contract is lost. These things happened in business. But taken together, it was a tightening net. Mark's projects, once the gold standard for being on time and on budget, became mired in a swamp of delays, cost overruns, and logistical nightmares. He was bleeding money, and he couldn't find the wound. While Mark was fighting fires on his construction sites, Elias began the second, more insidious phase of his attack, the silent acquisition of debt. Vance Construction was a billion-dollar company, but it ran on massive lines of credit, construction loans, and corporate bonds. It owed money to a dozen different financial institutions. From his Chicago command center, Elias directed his traders in New York with the detached precision of a grandmaster moving chess pieces. They began to buy that debt. They approached the banks, not with aggression, but with quiet, compelling offers. "We'll take that Vance portfolio off your hands at a 2% premium. It cleans up your balance sheet." To the banks, it was a simple, profitable transaction, offloading risk for a quick reward. They had no idea they were selling their leverage to a single, unseen entity. Within 9 months, Phoenix Holdings, through a web of intermediary corporations, became the primary creditor for more than 60% of Vance Construction's total outstanding debt. Mark still made his payments to Sterling Bank and Midwestern Trust, but the money was now being routed, silently and digitally, into the accounts of his younger brother. Elias now owned the chains that bound his family's empire. The pressure began to take its toll on Mark. The charismatic, unflappable CEO was becoming a paranoid, angry tyrant. He would storm through his offices, raging at his subordinates over scheduling errors that weren't their fault. His confident presentations to the board were now tinged with a defensive edge as he struggled to explain the shrinking profit margins. He started drinking earlier in the day, his evenings spent staring out the window of his father's office, a glass of scotch in his hand, trying to connect the dots. He felt a malevolent force at play, but he couldn't give it a name. He complained bitterly to his mother that the loyalty and honor their father had built the business on were gone, replaced by a new, ruthless breed of corporate players. He was right. He just didn't know that new breed had his own blood running through its veins. One evening, Elias left his sterile command center and walked through the city. He was just another anonymous man in a dark, well-tailored coat. He stood across the street from the Vance Tower, a monument to his family's pride, and felt nothing. No nostalgia, no anger, no pain. He was a surgeon, observing a patient, analyzing the subject of a future, complex operation. He then walked to the lakefront library, the first major project he had designed entirely on his own. He walked through its soaring, light-filled atrium, watching students reading and children playing in the space he had created. A security guard nodded at him politely. He was invisible, a ghost visiting his own creations. And in that moment, he felt the pure, cold clarity of his purpose. He wasn't there to reclaim what was his. He was there to conduct a controlled demolition. The breaking point for Mark's psyche came at a charity gala, the kind of event he usually dominated. He stood holding a glass of champagne, forcing a smile, when a rival developer, a man he despised, clapped him on the shoulder. "Tough break with the Civic Center, Mark," the man said, a smirk playing on his lips. "I hear you're having trouble getting concrete to set on time." The comment was a stiletto, sliding between his ribs. The whispers were starting. The sharks were smelling blood in the water. Mark's smile froze on his face. He looked out at the glittering crowd, at the powerful men and women who ran the city, and for the first time in his charmed life, he felt the icy grip of fear. He was the king of the feast, but he suddenly knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that there was a ghost at the table, and it was watching his every move. The 6 months of covert warfare had bled Mark Vance's empire slowly, a death by 1,000 cuts. His company, once a model of ruthless efficiency, was now bogged down in a quagmire of logistical failures and cost overruns. Mark's temper, always simmering beneath his polished surface, was now a constant, raging fire. But he was a fighter, and he believed he had found his salvation. The city of Chicago had just announced the Gateway Plaza project, a sprawling, multi-billion-dollar commercial and residential development that would redefine the city's western skyline. It was the largest, most prestigious contract in a generation. For Mark, winning it was not just a matter of business, it was an existential necessity. It would be a definitive statement that Vance Construction was still king, silencing the increasingly loud whispers of its decline. He threw every resource, every ounce of his energy, into crafting the perfect bid, seeing it as the single, decisive battle that would win him the war. From his silent command center, Elias watched his brother's frantic preparations with the cold detachment of a physicist observing a predictable reaction. The Gateway Plaza was not a lifeline for Mark. It was the anvil on which Elias planned to break him. This was the moment to step out of the shadows. The time for subtle pressure was over. The time for a public execution had arrived. On a massive, touch-sensitive drafting screen that covered an entire wall, Elias pulled up the schematics for the Gateway Plaza. For a moment, the architect within him, the boy who had dreamed of building things that sang, resurfaced. But this time, his genius was not fueled by passion, but by a cold, weaponized purpose. He spent 3 sleepless days and nights designing a counter-proposal. His design was a masterpiece, a symphony of glass and steel that was not only more aesthetically stunning than the Vance plan, but also vastly more efficient, incorporating sustainable technologies and a revolutionary structural system that would slash construction time by 20%. And then came the masterstroke. Because Elias, through Phoenix Holdings, now effectively controlled the regional supply of steel and concrete, he could underbid his brother by a staggering, impossible margin. He crafted a proposal that was not merely better, it was perfect. It was a bid designed not just to win, but to annihilate. The day the winner was announced, the main hall at Chicago City Hall was packed with reporters, developers, and politicians. Mark Vance stood in the front row, his smile broad, his confidence seemingly restored. He had seen the other bids. He knew his was the strongest. He had spent the last week calling in favors, reminding the selection committee of his family's long history of civic partnership. He believed, with the unshakable arrogance of a man who had never truly lost anything, that the contract was his. The mayor stood at the podium, lavishing praise on the city's ambition. While all the proposals were exceptional, the mayor boomed. One stood out for its breathtaking vision, its commitment to sustainability, and an unprecedented level of fiscal responsibility. It is my great honor to announce that the contract for the Gateway Plaza has been awarded to Phoenix Holdings of New York. The name dropped into the room like a stone into a silent pool. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Phoenix who? Mark's smile did not just fade, it shattered. The color drained from his face, leaving a sickly gray pallor. He stood frozen, the cameras flashing around him, capturing the precise moment his aura of invincibility was publicly extinguished. He had not just been outbid, he had been humiliated by a complete unknown, an outsider, a ghost. The king had been dethroned in his own court, and he had no idea who had wielded the sword. That evening, the Vance mansion was a tomb. Sarah Vance, Mark's wife of 10 years, moved through the cavernous rooms with the quiet resignation of a beautiful, well-cared-for prisoner. She had married the charming, dynamic Mark Vance, the city's most eligible bachelor. She had quickly learned, however, that she was merely his most valuable acquisition. Her life was a gilded cage of charity events, meaningless social obligations, and long, silent dinners where her husband's attention was perpetually fixed on his phone. Mark arrived home long after midnight, reeking of expensive whiskey. He didn't speak to her. He simply walked to the marble fireplace and with a roar of pure, impotent rage, hurled his crystal glass into it, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. He ranted for an hour, blaming his idiot team, disloyal city officials, ungrateful suppliers, everyone but himself. Sarah watched him, her expression placid, but her mind was a maelstrom of contempt. She was not a wife. She was a witness to the slow, ugly decay of a man's soul. A week later, Sarah attended a fundraising luncheon for the Chicago Symphony, an event she had tried to get out of. As she picked at her food, a woman approached her table. She was impeccably dressed, with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Mrs. Vance," the woman said, her voice low and direct. "Forgive my intrusion. I am an admirer of your emerald necklace." Before Sarah could respond, the woman discreetly placed a small, heavy, cream-colored envelope on the table beside Sarah's plate. "A client of mine believes you and he have a shared interest in seeing a more equitable and honest future emerge from the current landscape," she whispered. "He thought you might appreciate this." The woman gave a tight, professional smile and was gone, melting back into the society chatter. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. That evening, in the privacy of her bathroom, her hands trembling, she opened the envelope. Inside was not a letter, but a single, steel key and a card bearing a string of numbers for a secure messaging application. The next day, driven by a desperation she could no longer ignore, She went to a private mail facility in a different part of the city and used the key to open a small, anonymous box. Inside was a slim manila file. The contents stole her breath. There were photographs, professionally taken, of Mark with a young woman, an intern from his office entering a boutique hotel. But that was not the worst of it. Behind the photos were bank statements for an account in the Bahamas that Sarah had never known existed, showing lavish expenditures on jewelry, vacations, and rent for a luxury apartment she had never seen. The betrayal was absolute, documented in cold, hard numbers. Tucked into the file was another, smaller card. The message, typed, was simple. "This is a fraction of what he has hidden from you. I can provide you with a path to a new, independent life, free from deceit. My resources will become your resources. In return, I only ask for the truth." Sarah sat in her car for over an hour, the file in her lap, the edifice of her life crumbling around her. For years, she had been a passive ornament. She had endured the neglect, the coldness, the thinly veiled contempt. She had played her part. But seeing the proof, the calculated, long-term deceit, changed everything. The anonymous messenger wasn't just offering her an escape, they were offering her a weapon. That night, she installed the secure messaging app on a new, untraceable phone. She looked at the photos of her husband's infidelity, at the evidence of his secret life, and she felt the last vestiges of fear and loyalty burn away, replaced by a cold, clarifying resolve. She typed her first message. "What do you need to know?" Thousands of miles away, Elias Vance saw the message appear on his screen. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. The ghost at the feast now had an agent in the king's bedchamber. The cracks in the facade were about to become a catastrophic collapse. The public humiliation of losing the Gateway Plaza project was not a humbling experience for Mark Vance, it was a radicalizing one. The carefully constructed facade of the charismatic, confident leader crumbled under the immense pressure, revealing a man Eleanor Vance was beginning not to recognize. Her son, her golden boy, was becoming a stranger in his own home. He was volatile, his mood swinging wildly between bouts of furious, paranoid rage and sullen, alcohol-fueled despair. Their Sunday dinners, once a cherished ritual of family pride, became tense, uncomfortable affairs. Mark would rant about conspiracies, about unseen enemies in New York, about a market that had become inexplicably hostile. He saw betrayal in every delayed shipment and treachery in every difficult negotiation. He spoke of the business not with the passion of a builder, but with the bitter resentment of a king whose subjects had revolted. Eleanor watched him, her heart aching with a growing, nameless dread. She saw the way his hands trembled slightly until his second glass of scotch. She heard the way he spoke to the household staff, his tone clipped and dismissive. This was not the confident son who had taken the reins of his father's empire. This was a cornered animal, lashing out at shadows, and the sight of it unsettled her to her core. Her maternal instinct, so long focused on nurturing Mark's ambition, now sounded a quiet, persistent alarm. The man raging about his crumbling fortunes was not the man she had believed him to be, and the discrepancy was becoming too vast to ignore. One gray afternoon, seeking refuge from the oppressive atmosphere of the house, Eleanor found herself drawn to her late husband's study. The room had been kept exactly as he had left it, a sanctuary of leather-bound books, architectural models, and the lingering scent of his pipe tobacco. It was a place of quiet strength and moral clarity. Everything she felt was now missing from their lives. She ran her hand over the smooth, cool mahogany of his desk, not looking for anything in particular, but simply trying to feel a connection to his unwavering certainty. In a moment of quiet remembrance, she decided to organize some of his personal papers, a task she had put off for years. Inside a locked bottom drawer, she found a lacquered wooden box filled with old correspondence, and within it, a thick vellum envelope containing a long handwritten letter to his younger brother, William, dated just 6 months before his death. She settled into his leather armchair, the familiar creak, a comforting sound, and began to read. Richard's handwriting was a bold, confident scrawl, and his voice seemed to speak to her from the page. He wrote mostly of business, of his pride in the company's growth. But then, she came to a passage about their sons. "William," he wrote, I see so much of myself in both boys, but in such different ways. Mark has the fire, the ambition. He can command a room and sell a vision like no one I've ever seen. He has a brilliant mind for the game, but sometimes I worry he sees it as just that, a game to be won. He values the victory, perhaps more than the integrity of the win. He has a hunger in him that, if left unchecked, could lead him to take shortcuts. I never would. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She read on, her heart beginning to pound. And then there is Ethan. He is the opposite, quiet, contemplative. He has none of Mark's hunger for the spotlight. But my God, William, the boy has a gift. His design for the new lakefront library. It's pure poetry. It's the work of a deeply, profoundly honest man. He builds with his soul. He has a moral compass in him as true as any level on a construction site. Mark will be the face of this company, but Ethan will always be its heart. The letter fell from her trembling hands. The words echoed in the silent room, a voice from the grave that systematically dismantled the lie she had lived with for 5 years. A deeply, profoundly honest man. The boy she had cast out, the son she had condemned, was the one her husband had trusted implicitly. And Mark, the son she had defended and elevated, was the one her husband had feared would sacrifice integrity for victory. The confrontation scene from 5 years ago replayed in her mind, but this time with horrifying clarity. She saw not a guilty son's stammering denial, but a beloved child's stunned, uncomprehending heartbreak. She saw not a brother's pained duty, but a predator's masterful, cold-blooded performance. The entire foundation of her reality cracked. She had been the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and she had sentenced the wrong son. The guilt was a physical blow, a crushing weight that stole the air from her lungs. She had not just made a mistake, she had committed a monstrous, unforgivable maternal sin. For days, she moved through her life in a daze, the horrifying truth, a constant, sickening presence. She knew she couldn't confront Mark. He would lie. He would twist the narrative, charm her, and make her doubt her own sanity, just as he had done before. No. She needed more than her late husband's words. She needed proof. Acting with a quiet cunning she hadn't used in decades, she began her own discreet investigation. She contacted Arthur Finch, the former CFO who had tearfully corroborated Mark's story, now retired, in a quiet community in Naples, Florida. She reached him on his private line, her voice warm and matriarchal. She told him she was doing some estate planning and needed his help clarifying a few details regarding the family trust from around the time of that unfortunate business with Ethan. Finch was initially cordial, happy to hear from her. But as her questions grew more specific, asking about the exact timeline of the discovery, about the offshore accounts, his voice began to falter. It was a very difficult time, Mrs. Vance, he stammered, his voice thin and reedy over the phone. Mark handled most of the particulars. My memory is a bit hazy. His evasion was more damning than any confession. He was a numbers man, a creature of detail. His memory was not hazy. It was terrified. Eleanor did not press him. She didn't need to. She thanked him politely for his time and ended the call. His fear was the final piece of the puzzle. He was a weak man who had been coerced into participating in a lie, and 5 years later, the guilt still haunted him. Eleanor sat in the study, the letter on the desk beside her, the memory of Finch's panicked voice echoing in her ears. The truth was no longer a suspicion, it was a certainty. Her golden son was a fraud and a monster. Her quiet son was the victim of an unimaginable betrayal. And she, their mother, had been the willing instrument of that betrayal. The wave of grief and guilt that washed over her was immense, but as it receded, it left behind something hard and unyielding. The soft, sorrowful matriarch who had been so easily manipulated was gone. In her place was Richard Vance's wife, a woman of iron will and fierce, protective loyalty. Her loyalty had been misplaced for 5 long years, but now it had found its proper course. She didn't know how, and she didn't know when. But she made a silent vow to the memory of her husband and to the ghost of the son she had abandoned. She would wait. She would watch. And when the moment came, she would do whatever it took to see justice done. The mother's doubt had been forged into a mother's resolve. The board had a new, silent, and deeply motivated member. The boardroom on the top floor of the Vance Tower felt less like a seat of power and more like a funeral parlor. The air was thick with the scent of fear and failure. The dozen members of the board of directors sat around the massive mahogany table, their faces grim, their expensive suits doing little to hide their anxiety. Before them lay the details of an apocalypse, financial reports showing catastrophic losses, stock prices in a death spiral, and the final, humiliating document, a hostile takeover bid from a mysterious and aggressive New York-based firm, Phoenix Holdings. The offer was insultingly low, a predator's price for a dying beast, but it was perhaps the only alternative to a complete Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The legacy Richard Vance had built with his bare hands was on the verge of being sold for parts. At the head of the table stood Mark Vance. He looked as if he had aged 10 years in the last 6 months. His face was pale and drawn, but his eyes burned with a desperate, defiant fire. This was his last stand. He began to speak, his voice, though strained, still resonating with the practiced charisma that had been his greatest asset. He painted a masterful picture of a company under siege, not by his own mismanagement, but by a new, vicious form of corporate warfare. He spoke of unseen market forces and coordinated attacks on our supply lines. He portrayed himself as the valiant captain, weathering a hurricane that would have sunk any lesser man. He invoked his father's memory, his voice thick with emotion. "My father did not build this company to surrender at the first sign of a storm," he implored, his eyes sweeping across the board. "He built it to last. Reject this predatory offer. Give me your trust, and I swear on his legacy, I will steer us through this. We are Vances. We do not break." For a fleeting moment, the old magic worked. He sounded like a leader. He sounded like his father's son. As the final desperate words of his plea hung in the air, the double doors at the far end of the boardroom swung open. They didn't burst open. They opened with a slow, deliberate, and utterly silent grace that was more commanding than any loud noise. 2 impeccably dressed lawyers, a man and a woman, entered first. They stepped to the side, and then he walked in. The room, which had been leaning toward Mark's plea, snapped to attention. The man was tall and moved with a stillness that was unnerving. He wore a dark charcoal suit that seemed to be tailored from shadows and steel. His face was impassive, his features sharp and defined, but it was his eyes that seized the room. They were the color of a winter sky, and they radiated a cold, absolute confidence that made Mark's blustering defiance seem childish in comparison. This was a man who did not hope to win. He simply arrived and took. The male lawyer stepped forward. "Gentlemen, apologies for the interruption. We have a vested interest in this vote. Allow me to introduce the president and CEO of Phoenix Holdings, Mr. Elias Vance." The name landed like a grenade. Vance. A confused murmur erupted around the table. Was he a cousin? A forgotten relative? Mark stared, his mouth slightly agape. The face was different, harder, leaner, older, but the structure was familiar. And the eyes, dear God, the eyes. He saw the ghost of the boy he had destroyed, looking back at him from within this cold, powerful stranger. Elias glided to the side of the table, his presence commanding the space. He gave a slight nod to his lawyer, who tapped a key on a laptop. The massive presentation screen at the end of the room, which had been displaying Vance Construction's bleak financials, flickered to life. "Before you vote on my offer," Elias said, his voice calm, measured, and lethally precise, "I believe it's my fiduciary duty as your company's largest creditor to clarify the true source of your current difficulties." The first slide appeared. It was titled, "The Riverbend Development Project, a Case Study in Fraud." Mark's blood ran cold. Elias, with the dispassionate air of a university lecturer, began to speak. He presented the board with a meticulous, undeniable reconstruction of the 5-year-old crime. He displayed the forged wire transfers, the doctored emails, the network of shell corporations. He showed them a satellite image of the development land, which was, and always had been, an empty, undeveloped swamp. $15 million, Elias stated. siphoned from this company's coffers and deposited into this. The next image was a bank statement from an account in the Cayman Islands, under the name E. Vance Designs International. "This is absurd. Fabricated lies," Mark roared, finding his voice. "You can't just walk in here with these forgeries." Elias didn't even look at him. "A fair point, Mr. Vance," he said coolly. "Perhaps you will find a more credible source." He nodded to his lawyer again. The screen changed to a high-definition video. The face of Arthur Finch, the retired CFO, filled the screen. He looked frail, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and relief. He was giving a sworn, videotaped deposition. He confessed everything. He detailed, in a trembling voice, how Mark had planned the entire scheme, how he had coerced him into participating, and how they had together framed an innocent man to do it. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The board members stared, their faces masks of pale, horrified shock. They turned as one to look at Mark, their expressions of support now curdled into pure disgust. But Elias was not finished. "Mr. Finch's confession explains the past," he continued, his voice relentless. "Now, let us discuss the present." A new slide appeared, a complex web of corporate ownership. "For the past 12 months, your CEO has blamed the market for his failures. He has been mistaken. The market was not his enemy. I was." Elias then walked them through the acquisitions of Bedrock Concrete, of the steel supplier, of the glass fabricator. He showed them the debt consolidation, presenting documents that proved Phoenix Holdings was the legal owner of the vast majority of their debt. "Every delayed shipment, every price hike, every logistical nightmare you have endured," Elias said, his cold eyes finally locking onto his brother's, "was a deliberate, calculated, and perfectly executed act of war. You weren't navigating a storm, Mark. You were sinking in a bathtub, and I had my hand on the faucet." Mark, now pale and sweating, completely unhinged, slammed his hands on the table. "Why?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Who are you? Why would you do this to my company?" Elias took a slow step towards him, the mask of the cold CEO dropping for a fraction of a second, allowing 5 years of condensed fury to flicker in his eyes. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the silent, cavernous room. "You ask me who I am?" he said softly. "You ask me why?" He paused, letting the moment stretch, letting his brother tremble in the face of the ghost he could not name. "You should know. After all, you created me. In the fire of your greed and your jealousy. You gave me my new name the night you threw me out into the rain to die. Brother." The word brother struck Mark like a physical blow. He staggered back, collapsing into his chair, his face a canvas of utter, soul-shattering recognition. A choked gasp came from somewhere down the table. The ghost finally had a name, and his name was Ethan. The final gambit had been played. It was checkmate. The word hung in the air, electric and absolute. Brother. For a long, suspended moment, the only sound in the boardroom was the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system. The collective shock was a physical presence, sucking the very air from the room. The board members, titans of Chicago industry, stared with wide, unblinking eyes, their minds struggling to reconcile the disgraced, exiled boy from 5 years ago with the cold, powerful billionaire who now stood before them, holding the fate of their company in his hands. The ghost was no longer a phantom. He had a name, he had a face, and he had come to claim his kingdom. Mark was the first to break. A strangled, guttural sound escaped his lips, a noise of pure, primal denial. He staggered to his feet, his face slick with sweat, his eyes wild. "No," he croaked, pointing a trembling finger at Ethan. "Number. It's a lie, a trick. He was always jealous, always weak. He couldn't build anything for himself, so he's come back to steal what's mine." His voice rose to a hysterical shriek, but the words were hollow, pathetic. The accusations that had worked so well on a trusting mother and a complacent board 5 years ago were now just the desperate death rattle of a condemned man. No one was listening. Their eyes were fixed on the mountain of irrefutable evidence displayed on the screen, on the videotaped confession of Arthur Finch, on the cold, unwavering gaze of the man who called himself Elias. Mark, realizing he had lost the board, turned in a final, desperate appeal to his last and greatest ally. His face crumpled, the rage dissolving into a pleading whimper. "Mother," he begged, his voice cracking. "Tell them, please, you know him, you know what he island. Tell them, it's not true." He was no longer the CEO, the golden son. He was a child, seeking refuge from a truth he could not escape. And then, Eleanor Vance rose. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman carrying an immense weight. In her hand, she clutched the letter from her late husband, the paper crumpled from being held so tightly. Her face was a landscape of grief, her eyes red-rimmed from tears shed in private, but her expression was one of absolute, unshakable resolve. She did not look at Mark. Her gaze found Ethan's across the long, polished table. "For 5 years," she said, her voice trembling but carrying a surprising strength that silenced the room completely, "I have lived in the dark. I built a house upon a lie because the truth was too painful to bear. I chose to believe a comfortable story over a difficult reality." Her voice broke for a moment, thick with a mother's profound regret. "I failed, my husband's memory. And Ethan, I failed you." She took a deep breath, her eyes locking with his. "Your father knew you. He wrote this letter, and in it, he spoke of your soul. He knew your heart, and he knew your integrity. And I am so sorry that I allowed myself to forget." It was an apology, a confession, and an absolution, all in one. Then, with a visible effort, she turned her gaze upon Mark. The warmth and love that had defined that gaze for his entire life were gone, replaced by a look as cold and hard as a judge's gavel. "You," she said, her voice now devoid of any emotion but a terrible, quiet finality. "You built your life on a foundation of deceit. You used my love as a weapon, and your father's good name as a shield for your greed. You are not his son, not in spirit. You are a stranger to this family and to the values it was built on." She turned from her broken son to the stunned faces of the board. "I, Eleanor Vance, as a primary shareholder of this company, formally withdraw my support for the current CEO. I second the motion to accept the takeover offer from Phoenix Holdings, as it is the only path forward." She paused, her voice ringing with the absolute authority of the matriarch. "And I make a new motion. The immediate and unconditional removal of Mark Vance from this board, from his position as CEO, and from any and all affiliations with Vance Construction, pending a full criminal investigation into his activities." Her words were the final nail in the coffin. The chairman, a man who had known Mark since he was a boy, looked at him with pity and disgust, and then called for the vote. "All in favor of the removal of Mark Vance?" One by one, hands went up around the table. There was no hesitation. It was swift. It was brutal. It was unanimous. In the space of 30 seconds, Mark Vance was erased. The subsequent vote to accept the Phoenix Holdings offer was a mere formality. The kingdom had officially fallen. The Vance Construction empire now belonged to Ethan. The board members, visibly uncomfortable and eager to distance themselves from the carnage, quickly gathered their papers and filed out of the room, offering quiet, awkward condolences to Eleanor as they passed. Soon, only the three of them remained, a tragic tableau of a family that had devoured itself. The air was thick with the ghosts of 5 years of pain. Mark, slumped in his chair, looked at Ethan, his eyes vacant, stripped of all their former fire. "Ethan," he whispered, the name sounding foreign. "Please, we're brothers. We can fix this. Remember building forts in the yard? Remember Dad teaching us?" Ethan cut him off, not with anger, but with a voice as quiet and final as a closing door. "The boy you remember is dead, Mark. You killed him that night. I am what you made me." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over his brother. "This was never about taking the company. You think in terms of profit and loss, of winning and losing. That's all you've ever understood. This was about a debt, an imbalance in the world that needed to be corrected. Today," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "it has been paid in full." Eleanor looked at Mark, her firstborn, the son she had adored and enabled, and a great, shuddering sigh of profound sorrow escaped her. There was no anger left, only the ashes of her love. "Go, Mark," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "There is nothing left for you here." And he did. He stood on unsteady legs, his magnificent suit now looking like a costume on a broken mannequin. He didn't look at either of them again. He simply turned and walked. He walked past the chair where his father had sat, past the models of the buildings his brother had designed, and out of the boardroom doors for the last time. He was not escorted. He was not thrown out. He simply ceased to be. Ethan remained, standing by the great floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the sprawling city below. Eleanor came and stood beside him, not touching, just sharing the silence. The reflection in the glass showed a man who had won a total, absolute victory, but his eyes, staring out at the kingdom he now owned, showed no trace of joy. They showed only the quiet, immense, and heavy burden of a justice that had been sought and found at last. The reckoning was over. In the weeks that followed the reckoning, a quiet, seismic shift occurred at the company that had once been Vance Construction. The first and most visible change was the name. The gleaming brass letters on the front of the tower were taken down, replaced by new ones that read, "Vance and Son Legacy." It was not a branding decision. It was a purification, a statement to the city and to the world that the era of Mark Vance's toxic ambition was over and the principles of his father were being restored. Ethan, now the sole owner of the empire, did not take his brother's seat at the head of the table. He had no interest in being a king. He spent 2 weeks conducting a meticulous, nationwide search, finally appointing a widely respected, older CEO known for her integrity and her steady hand. His instructions to her were simple: build things that last, value character over profit, make this a company my father would be proud of again. His role became that of a silent guardian, the unseen owner ensuring the flame of his father's principles was never again extinguished. He met with his mother one last time in his father's old office. The space between them was filled with the ghosts of 5 years of silence and pain. Eleanor looked frail, the iron resolve she had shown at the board meeting having given way to a deep, weary sorrow. She formally signed over her controlling shares to him, completing his absolute ownership. "There are no words, Ethan," she whispered, her eyes filled with a lifetime of regret. "No apology can ever be enough to give you back the years I allowed him to steal from you." Ethan looked at the woman who had both given him life and condemned him, and he felt not the hot rage of the past, but a profound, quiet sadness. "I know," he said, his voice gentle, "and I don't hate you. But the family we were, it died 5 years ago. Mark killed it, and we can't pretend otherwise." He paused, looking out the window at the city below. "Maybe, in time, we can build something new, something honest, but it will be on the ruins of what came before." It was not a fairy tale reconciliation, but it was a truth, and for the first time in a long time, the Vance family was dealing in truth. With his affairs in Chicago settled, Ethan flew to New York. He went to Alistair Blackwood's penthouse, not as the desperate janitor or the eager student, but as a peer. Alistair greeted him with a rare, thin smile and poured 2 glasses of a dark, expensive brandy. To a project successfully completed, Alistair toasted, his voice a low rumble. Ethan raised his glass. "I couldn't have done it without you, Alistair. You gave me the tools, the knowledge. You gave me a chance when the entire world had turned its back. I will forever be in your debt." Alistair waved his gratitude away with a dismissive flick of his wrist. He grew serious, his old eyes looking past Ethan into a distant memory. "There is one final piece of this story you need to understand, Elias," he said, using the name that had become his creation. "The real reason I chose to help you." He took a slow sip of his brandy. 45 years ago, I was not Alistair Blackwood, the Titan. I was just Ali, a young, hungry architect with more ambition than capital, and I had a partner, a man with more talent and more integrity than anyone I have ever known. We built our first company together, from nothing. His name was Richard Vance. Ethan froze, the glass halfway to his lips. "He was your father," Alistair continued, his voice heavy with the weight of a lifelong confession. He was my best friend, and I betrayed him. I saw an opportunity to take the company for myself, to push him out in a ruthless corporate maneuver. I was young, I was arrogant, and I was greedy. I was everything your brother Mark turned out to be. I built this entire empire on the foundation of that first, terrible betrayal. And for 45 years, I have lived with his ghost, with the knowledge that I sacrificed the only true friend I ever had for money and power. He finally met Ethan's stunned gaze. When I found you, when I heard your story, I saw a chance. A strange, cosmic opportunity to right a generational wrong. I saw your father's integrity in you, and I saw my own worst sins in your brother, forging you into the weapon that would destroy Mark. It was my way of destroying the part of myself I have always hated, ensuring that Richard Vance's true legacy, his honest son, would ultimately triumph. It was the only form of atonement a man like me had left. The revelation settled upon Ethan, reframing his entire 5-year crusade. His quest for justice had not been his alone. He had been an instrument of atonement, a warrior in a battle that had begun before he was even born. His personal tragedy was a single, painful chapter in a much longer story of karma, of debts that echoed across the decades, demanding to be paid. His victory was not just his own, it was his father's, and in a strange, tragic way, it was Alistair's redemption. On the flight back to Chicago, as the private jet soared through the endless expanse of the night sky, Ethan finally understood. He was not the naive Ethan anymore, nor was he the cold, unfeeling Elias. He was something else, a man forged in the fires of a terrible betrayal, but tempered by the discovery of a profound, interconnected truth. He had learned that justice is not always a clean, swift stroke of a sword, but sometimes a long, patient, and complex weaving of fates. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured for too long. For when they finally decide to act, they do not merely create a storm, they are the storm. Justice can take many forms, and sometimes it is delivered not by a court of law, but by the patient, calculating hands of those who were once its victims. The scales of the Vance family had finally been balanced at a terrible, unimaginable cost. Thank you for listening. We will see you in the next story.